Let's settle this once and for all, shall we? The big question we've all been waiting for. Is Little Nightmares 2 a sequel or a prequel? I created a poll earlier today, with majority of you voting that Little Nightmares 2 is a prequel, and a considerable large number of you, with some mentioning that it's both, which I will briefly touch on as well. Just to be clear, I won't take any sides in this video to whether it's a prequel or a sequel. I will analyze and discuss the evidence for and against each argument, and let you discuss it further in the comment section. Hi folks, I'm R, your narrator, and here we have Is Little Nightmares 2 a sequel or a prequel? Before we get into the video, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, and beware, as there will be spoilers ahead. Let's start by analyzing and discussing 4 arguments that it's a prequel. The major factor that contributes to the 4 argument that it's a prequel is the absence of the yellow raincoat when we find Six trapped within the Hunter's house room. If Little Nightmares 2 was indeed a sequel, Six would have had her raincoat on, as she left the mall wearing her raincoat. Instead, we find the raincoat lying in a parcel room, which Six doesn't seem too fazed about when she finds it. Therefore, the jacket argument can be used as evidence for the game being a prequel. However, we'll get back to that in the against segment. Another major evidence that proves Little Nightmares 2 is a prequel is that Six doesn't have her powers here, which she absorbed from the lady. At the end of Little Nightmares 1, Six starts chomping on the lady. She then gets some black clouds being absorbed into her body. As she heads out for the exit, some guests try to attack her, but she simply uses her powers and drains these guests of life, killing them instantly. This power is absent in Little Nightmares 2, and we don't see Six using it at all. If this game was a sequel, she could easily use this power and get herself out of trouble with many of the perpetrators, and she wouldn't get trapped in the Hunter's house in the first place. The only logical explanation at this point for being a prequelist is that she hasn't met the lady yet, and she's yet to absorb her powers. Next big evidence siding with Little Nightmares 2 being a prequel is that the Shadow Six appears at the end of the game rather than throughout the game, as we witnessed in Little Nightmares 1. Therefore, it might suggest that Shadow Six was created after interacting with the Thin Man, as we see the Shadow Six appear when the Thin Man kidnaps her. Then another reason for Little Nightmares 2 to be a prequel is that Six doesn't experience any hunger bouts throughout the game until the very end, whereas in the first game, she experiences these hunger bouts throughout the game. Therefore, this again can suggest that Six developed her hunger bouts after interacting with the Thin Man, which we see at the end of the game, which is then carried on in the first game. Another major evidence for Little Nightmares 2 to be a prequel is that at the end, Shadow Six looks at a leaflet of the maw and insinuates to Six to go there and relieve her hunger bouts. Therefore, this creates the perfect premise for Little Nightmares 1 to be a sequel, with Little Nightmares 2 being the origin of how Six developed her hunger bouts and how she left to the maw. I think these points for Little Nightmares 2 being a prequel creates a solid argument. Let's go ahead now and discuss what can be argued against these points to challenge this argument. First major point to discuss is that the yellow raincoat is not in possession of Six, and it's something we find further down the line in Little Nightmares 2. Something that challenges this idea is that in Very Little Nightmares, Six presumably wears the yellow raincoat, as it floats above the water, but as we don't see her put it on, we can't say for sure. Although, the jacket floating atop the water would seem a little pointless if Six wouldn't wear it. Or you might also say that they displayed that scene to imply that this mysterious girl is Six. Another argument against this point is that Six might have simply dropped her jacket when she arrived at the Pale City. We can see that the raincoat is placed in a parcel room. Maybe it is where the guests get on board the ship to leave to the maw. Six used the ship at the end of Little Nightmares 1, which we hear a ship horn from, and gets to this point and drops her jacket. Six, unfazed about her jacket, might suggest that she's amnesiac, as I've theorized previously analyzing the information in the comics and Six's description in Bandai Namco's website, which do suggest that Six forgets or chooses to forget. The next point that we can challenge is that Six doesn't use her powers in the Pale City, as her powers have diminished. As the description of 6 reads, she awakens in a city she cannot recognize. She has already seen more than any normal child, and a game description where it reads that 6 is fading from this world and her only hope is to guide Mono to the signal tower. Therefore, her powers are diminishing and her only hope is to lure Mono to the radio tower where she drops him so he can become the new Thin Man. I theorize that 6's powers are fading as she hasn't been absorbing life forces, as the Pale City is a dead city. But in the Ma, it was full of life and delicious guests for 6 to consume. Another point against Shadow 6 appearing at the end is that 6 has been losing her powers in the Pale City, and as we can assume, her powers are connected to the Shadow. Therefore, the Shadow appears only at the end to direct 6 to the Ma. The Shadow doesn't appear throughout the game as it's weak and can't tempt 6 to absorb more life forces to regain power over 6. Also, the Thin Man seemingly separated 6 from her Shadow when he kidnapped her, presumably to save her, save Mono, and subsequently himself from an eternal time loop repeating itself. At the final scene, we see 6 get back to her Shadow in the same room she was kidnapped from. So this means that the Shadow 6 was always within 6, but was separated from 6 by the Thin Man, who then gets reunited with 6 at the end, after manipulating Mono to kill Thin Man and dropping him to the depth where he suffers his doomed fate. 6 also doesn't experience any hunger bouts throughout Little Nightmares 2, but this could easily be explained that she is fading away. Therefore, her powers and Shadow 6 are getting weaker, which means they are not powerful enough to urge and tempt 6 to absorb life forces in order for them, the Shadow, and her powers to get stronger, which is through burdening 6 with the hunger bouts to absorb life forces to re-energize. And finally, at the end, Shadow 6 looks at a picture of the Ma and directs 6 to travel there. 6 could have easily traveled to the Pale City from the Ma, and now realizing that she can't survive in the Pale City and that she needs to absorb life forces, she gets directed by her Shadow to get back to the Ma. Therefore, this counter-argument refuted the other argument I mentioned in the previous segment. Another counter-argument is that 6 awakens in a suitcase in the Ma. How did she get in the suitcase from the Pale City? It's something that hasn't been shown or explained. Therefore, this suggests that there is a different origin. Okay, so these were for and against arguments of Little Nightmares 2 being a prequel. I'll let you guys discuss these further down in the comment section. Now let's move on to arguments for and against Little Nightmares 2 being a sequel. Here are some of the most reasonable arguments for Little Nightmares 2 being a sequel. 6 has drawings of a gnome in the room she's trapped in. Going to the attic, we find gnomes lurking around. As we know from Little Nightmares 1, the lady is presumably the only entity capable of turning children into gnomes who are then forced into work to throw coal into the furnace of the Ma. The presence of the gnomes where 6 has presumably been trapped in for a while could suggest 2 things. That 6 turned some children into gnomes, as she has absorbed the lady's powers and she could easily do that now. And another, that these gnomes traveled from the Ma to the Pale City in the same ship she traveled to the Pale City from the Ma. Both providing evidence that Little Nightmares 2 is a sequel. Another big evidence is that at the end of Little Nightmares 1, 6 stands outside of the main door of the Ma. We hear a ship horn at the distance and the screen fades to black. This strongly insinuates that 6 got on the ship and traveled to the Pale City. Otherwise, why would we hear a ship horn? And why would she exit the Ma? Where would she travel to? Especially that her powers crave life forces, with the Ma being the perfect place for that. Another argument is that 6 will become the lady. That makes sense for the sequelists as 6 has the lady's powers. 6 craves life forces, and as far as we know, the world in Little Nightmares is dead and empty, with the nest and the Pale City being the possible reachable places from the Ma in a ship. In the description of the lady, we read that she needs the Ma and the Ma needs her. The guests are referred to as herds, therefore they are livestock lured into the Ma to be eaten or have their life forces absorbed by the lady, an attribute that both the lady and 6 share. Therefore, the Ma is the right place for 6, the future lady. Why would she leave it after learning she needs to satiate her shadow and re-energize her powers? I won't get too much in depth to why 6 is the lady, as I've already talked about it in a previous video, which you can watch by hitting the card above. Now let's go over the counter-arguments against Little Nightmares 2 being a sequel. The first argument is about the gnomes being present in the attic and the picture in 6's room. As the gnomes run away as well, it's possible they sailed across from the mod to the Pale City themselves. Or even maybe the lady was at some point present in the Pale City. Regarding the drawing of 6 with a gnome, this might simply suggest that she probably interacted with some of the gnomes in the attic. The drawing doesn't necessarily mean that she has been to the maw. The next counter-argument is that 6 could easily not leave the maw at the end of Little Nightmares 1. Stay and wait for the next horde of guests to arrive, greet them to their doomed final place, and claim her position as the new lady. And the final point is that 6 is the future lady. As I mentioned already, 6 can very easily be the lady while Little Nightmares 2 being a prequel. She travels to the mob being directed by her shadow and suffering a hunger bout. She kills the lady and absorbs her powers. She then claims her position as the new lady by the end of Little Nightmares 1 and awaits a new ship offloading another batch of guests for her and the maw to survive. And finally, there are some evidence that Little Nightmares 2 is both a sequel and a prequel. As we've established from previous theories that the loop theory is the most plausible one, it makes sense that Little Nightmares 2 is both a sequel and a prequel, or in other words, a pre-sequel. This means that the events of Little Nightmares 2 happened both before and after Little Nightmares 1. As the story of Little Nightmares is a loop, there's no beginning or ending. The events can very well happen before and after. All events presumably in the future or past depend on each other to take place. The events of the future depend on certain actions in the past, and the events of the past depend on certain actions in the future. For example, if future Mono, the Thin Man, wouldn't kidnap 6, Mono probably wouldn't chase after him and get enraged to the point of killing him. Analyze the information and keep in mind that there's a strong hint that it's a loop, so no ending or beginning. All related. Everything that 6 did, she did as she was supposed to, for the loop to take place. Every time she pulled Mono out of the TVs before reaching the door, and specifically pulling him out when he got to the Thin Man, to stop them from talking to each other possibly. Manipulating Thin Man to kidnap her by throwing a younger Thin Man, Mono, into the depth, so that Mono kills Thin Man without giving him the chance to talk. The raincoat, the suitcase, the shadow, the hunger, her becoming the lady, all are part of the time loop. Discuss in the comment section what you think Little Nightmares 2 is. A prequel, a sequel, or a pre-sequel, and try to explain your opinion by using the evidence and arguments provided in the video, or even using your own evidence. On that note, this brings us to the end of the video. Thanks for watching the video. You've been a great audience. For more videos, keep tuned by hitting the subscribe button and the notification bell. You can also follow me on the Twitter for the latest announcements and general chats. I've been your host R. Till the next video, have a fantastic day.